Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Law Enforcement Crash Report Review Guidelines webinar. Thanks so much for joining us. Hoping that everybody can hear me. And to get us started, we have Sergeant Foley from the Worcester Police Department. Welcome, Sergeant Foley.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Robin. First, I'd like to start by thanking everyone who decided to participate in this webinar today, put on by UMass SAFE and funded by EOPS, Office of Grants and Research. I must admit, I had no idea what Zoom was until last week when all of my kids' activities were instructed and streamed via the app. It has proven to be a great tool in delivering educational and instructional material while practicing our social distancing, although it has provided my wife and I a break from trying to facilitate the chaotic learning environment at our house. But I'm sure many of us have heard enough about social distancing, and we are here to find out what this webinar is about and who this is leading the introduction. My name is Sergeant Foley, and I work for the Worcester Police Department. I'm currently the sergeant in charge of the Crash Reconstruction, Commercial Motor Vehicle, and Traffic Unit. Prior to becoming a sergeant, I spent several years as a crash reconstructionist. During that time, I authored hundreds of crash reports, some straightforward and others were a bit more complicated. I'm sure some of us who have used the carbon copy crash reporting system in the years past have had the unfortunate experience of pulling into a crash scene and realizing you may not have enough pages left in your crash book to include all the vehicles damaged by an operator. While I always tried to make sure I had included all the information for those types of crashes, the constant flipping back and forth between the crash form and the description field box flap, I sometimes would miss field boxes. Weeks later, I would get my nasty gram from Records Division asking me to fix the crash report. By the time I received the crash report back, my CJIS query and 3x5s with all the information were shredded, and my ability to complete the crash report accurately was lost. Times have changed, and the most departments have transitioned over to electronic crash reporting forms, making it easier. While some of us have accepted the change, some officers are reluctant and resist change and have decided to continue to be creatures of habit. Some still believe that just a money-making tool for the insurance company, so why put in the time and effort into the report? I remember during my police academy being told, remember, this report will only be requested by the operator and the insurance company, no one else. And as a young officer, I remember veteran officers telling me to include both the operator statements and let them figure it out. There was no push to investigate who was at fault for the crash. It was never explained during the data or during the academy at any time in my career, the insurance company utilizing these crash reports. And like many others, I just assumed it was for insurance purposes only. Unfortunately, I'm not the only one who has had this mindset. Departmental policies, lack of training, and lack of motivation and lack of supervisory review of crash reports over the years has led to a need to address how crash reports are generated and completed. It has also led to the need for additional training on how to accurately complete crash reports. Last fall, when I entered my current position, I found out very quickly how important vital and accurate crash reports were. While in my first week, I was asked by my lieutenant to pull crash data for the chief's office. The chief had a meeting with the city manager. As I started to look at the crash data, I realized that there were many inconsistencies with crash reports. Many fields were incomplete and direction of travel was not always accurate. Addresses for major intersections or crosswalk locations were not accurate. I found out that our dispatchers would use the caller's location and officers would not correct the location after responding to the scene of the crash. Errors like that could potentially skew the crash data for a particular location and prohibit traffic engineering from developing safety measures to reduce crashes, in some cases, fatalities. It could potentially cause traffic unit to waste resources in areas that were misidentified for enforcement locations. Something as simple as skipping or misidentifying street lighting at the time of a crash may cause a poorly lit area not to be identified. In addition to the data requests from the chief and City Hall, I was told I would facilitate and apply for the 2020 the traffic enforcement and STEP grants. I'm sure many of you here are fully aware of these applicants, what these applications entail. Crash statistics. Again, I quickly realized how important accurate crash reporting was to help identify crash hotspots and location of risky driving behaviors. I realized some crash reports were missing whether the driver was seatbelted or unseatbelted. Some were missing airbag deployment, other were missing whether or not the person was transported to the hospital. Some lacked passenger information where the person was seated in the vehicle. In addition to passenger data, non-motorist data, particularly pedestrian data, was not accurate. All of these fields were important, yet they were sometimes missing in reports. I'm not sure if it's just for the insurance companies, so they'll figure it out into the minds of the officers when they were doing these reports. But we as supervisors need to change the mindset and start to educate our officers as to the importance of having accurate and complete crash reports. We must have a buy-in that starts at the top so that our officers may see the importance as to why they need to put more effort into their crash reports. They need to realize it's not just for insurance companies. Luckily, MPTC has already incorporated a 24-hour block of crash report writing into the curriculum using the e-manual. So new officers have an understanding of the importance of accurate and complete reports. And as you can see here by the slide in front of you, there's many different ways that these crash reports are used, and I went over a couple of them when I went over my narrative here. And if we go to the next slide, that specifically you could see on the right-hand side, looking at the pedestrian data for Worcester and the major areas which pop up very frequently, of course, is Kelly Square. And if any of you are familiar with Kelly Square, there's about 5 or 6 roadways dumping into one area. And so recently, with the help of the ballpark as well coming into the city, they're redeveloping that whole entire area. And actually, they're going to change the direction of 2 of the streets and put in a peanut rotary to alleviate some of that problem, and then hopefully create safer ways for pedestrians to cross the roadway. So how do we as supervisors correct these deficiencies in crash reports? And how do we educate our veteran officers who do not have crash report training since their academy? I remember I think my crash report writing was maybe a 2-hour block. So a lot of these new guys have the training, but how do we address our veteran officers and how do we reach them? So through the research, UMass Safe Director Robin Reisman and her group have developed literature and educational tools to help supervisors and officers improve the accuracy and quality of crash reports. Ultimately, these improvements in data collection within the crash reports will help improve roadway safety and lead to the reduction in fatalities, which is the ultimate goal. To speak about the literature, I turn it back over to the director, Robin Reisman.
Thanks so much, Sergeant Foley. Really appreciate your help and your insight here. What I want to do is just talk pretty briefly about the materials that we've created and how we created them and what they're designed to do, and then open it up for discussion amongst all of you. So these are the resources that we created. They were designed both for officers and troopers as well as for supervisors as they're reviewing crash reports. So the supervisor's guide also includes the other 2 pieces, the important crash report elements and the narrative guidelines. And then they're also, you can also download them at this website as separate documents. But first, I'd like to just give you a little bit of background on how we created these. Next slide. So let's start with the narrative guidelines. We learned that law enforcement really had never received any specific guidance about what should be included in the narratives and what shouldn't. So we decided to create this pilot test and gather input from the stakeholders shown on the slide, and then create some guidelines that could be pilot tested in these police departments, gather some feedback, and then offer them up to the rest of the state. So interestingly, there really weren't any guidelines to start with, and as we read over them, we found that they varied distinctly. And so some officers had really short narratives, some had really long narratives, and different departments chose what to include and not include in those guidelines. Next slide. So in the hopes of making it clearer and creating a way for narratives to be more concise, we created these guidelines. And as you can see, the items under the green traffic light are the ones that we're suggesting be included in the narrative. The ones under the yellow traffic light are those that can be included if you wish, but are not necessary because they're available in other sections of the crash report. And those under the red light are things that shouldn't be included in the crash narrative, most specifically, any personal identifying information. So as you know, the crash narrative is used to describe the crash and really describe anything that's unusual about the crash that's different than what an officer can include in the coded fields. And that's the idea behind these guidelines. On this slide, you can see a sample of a crash narrative that includes the information listed here. One of the things we're suggesting is that officers use vehicle 1 and vehicle 2 and driver 1 and driver 2, as many of you do, because that helps us get away from the personal identifying information. So if folks contact the Registry of Motor Vehicles and ask for a crash report, if there's personal identifying information, the registry has to dedact that before they can share that crash report. So using this V1 and V2 and D1 and D2 helps alleviate that problem. So these guidelines should be used for the first paragraph of the narrative, and then if your specific police department has a policy where it wishes other information to be included, that can be included in the second paragraph. In this way, all departments will have narratives that are really similar. That will help the registry as they're using those narratives, as well as analysts who use the information in the narratives to develop programming to prevent crashes. I can't stress enough that it's really important not to include the personal identifying information. And in addition, to note that any supplemental narrative that is submitted with a crash report instead of the narrative on the crash report form is not received by the Registry of Motor Vehicles. So sometimes officers want to include a much more lengthy narrative due perhaps to the complexity of the crash, but if it is submitted as a separate document, the registry doesn't include it, and therefore it's not in their crash data system. So what we're asking is that officers use these guidelines as they're writing up the narrative on the crash report, and we're asking that supervisors take a look at the narrative to see if it's meeting these qualifications. Next slide. So the other piece of what we did was look at important crash report elements that are often left empty or miscoded on crash report forms. And what we found in doing an analysis with the Registry of Motor Vehicles is that these 15 fields often have either invalid information, an invalid code, or are left empty. Now, I know there's lots of reasons why these fields are left empty and lots of good reasons. So for example, if drivers and passengers are outside of the car before the officer arrives on the scene, then the officer doesn't know if the driver or passengers were belted in the car or not. So what the registry is asking is that you fill out that field with a 99 or an unknown instead of leaving it blank. Another thing that we hear from officers is if a field is not applicable, then they leave it blank. So for example, if a vehicle was not towed because there was no damage, then we've heard from officers that they often leave that field blank. But the Registry of Motor Vehicles is asking that instead the coded field of no is entered there. In other cases, we see that officers will leave blank the passenger injury status, airbag status, ejected code, and transport code. So if a passenger was not injured and their airbag was not deployed and they were not ejected and they were not transported, this whole section of the crash report is often left empty. And again, the registry is asking that instead of leaving fields empty, you put unknown or other or not applicable in that section. And the registry is also asking that when the supervisors are reviewing crash reports before they're submitting them to the registry, that those are the specific fields that are reviewed. So here is an informational flyer going over those fields. I think the content is not new. Each of these is something that you're very familiar with, but we're hoping this is a reminder that these are the fields that are the most important to complete, or these are the fields that are most often left empty and that we're trying to promote use for. Next slide. So all of those materials are available to officers and troopers and supervisors on the Law Enforcement Crash Report e-manual, and this is the website. So it's masscrashreportmanual.com. Many of you know about this tool and have been using it in a variety of different instances, but since some of you aren't, we thought we'd just take a couple of minutes to talk about the manual and how you can use it. So the idea was that it would improve the collection of crash data and that it would give officers a place where, that's fine, you can go to the next slide, give officers a place where they could look up information as they were needing it. So you can search for any crash report field or attribute that you're looking for more information on. You can also look up information about the various location methods on the crash report and guidance on how to fill those out, as well as a variety of other things. And if you look at the next slide, here's an example. So if you queried injury status in the search box on this tool, this is what you would find. You would find instructions, a definition, a rationale for why it's important, and then information about all the coded options. This is, I think, kind of an interesting one because the registry fairly recently changed the injury status coded fields on the crash report, and they were changed from incapacitating injury options to serious injury, unknown injury, suspected minor injury, etc. And so this particular section of the crash report manual provides all of those different options. And then you can see on the right, for folks that are interested in further information, it shows the results of a crash data audit and how this field is being utilized and not utilized by police departments. You look at the next slide. This is just another example of a coded field that can be searched. So people searched traffic way description, and this is the kind of information that they provided. Or you can look at the next one. Next slide. Okay, so that is a little bit of information about the crash report manual. But let's go back to the tools for improving crash report reviews. These are the samples of the materials that are available. Again, you can get them on the masscrashreportmanual.com website. And what we began to do here was think about what are some possible ways that we can disseminate this information and get it out in the field and used by officers. And here are just some examples that we came up with for potential ways that we can disseminate this information. But I wanted to ask you all if you felt like there were other ways that would make more sense or should get added to this. And why don't we start with Sergeant Foley? Do you think, Sergeant, that there's other ways that we can get this information out to officers and troopers and supervisors?
I think probably one of the best ways, honestly, is what you've already had listed for us would be through in-service training and roll calls. I mean, you're going to reach the biggest amount of people that way. In our particular department, that's going to be the best way to reach the volume of guys that we have.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, everybody. We will post the content of this webinar again on the Crash e-report manual. So if other folks in your department weren't able to participate but would like to listen to the dialogue, that can be accessed there as well as the materials. Thanks again.